So this is the book that we are going to be talking about today, which is very enjoyable. And Josh and I have both, I've made it most of the way through. Josh read it in its entirety, and it was absolutely fascinating. So would you be able to give a brief summary for people who have not been able to read it, and tell us what your goals were in writing it?
Yeah, so it deals with two old, but I think still really kind of burning questions for the field of Bible and Near Eastern studies. The first one is very, very basic, which is what do these people who wrote this literature think they were doing? What did they? Because one thing that we know about the Bible is that it contains a lot of things that are supposed to be the word of God, that are said to be, the word of the Lord came to me and said X. You get this, all throughout. But sometimes the messages seem to change or diverge or even contradict. Famously, there's two contradictory versions of how the world is created at the very beginning of the Bible. So it starts off with, but so then the question becomes, why did these people, how did they think that they could just write these other things? They could change what they said was the word of God, or add in versions of the word of God that contradicted the first version. This has to be deliberate. It wasn't just an accident of, that they put a bunch of, scrolls into a hat and then pulled out to the two that they just grabbed first. So who did they think they were? And the second one that turns out to be related is about how to understand the contacts and relationships between ancient Israel and Judah, the cultures that created the Hebrew Bible, and their neighbors, because ever since we discovered ancient Babylonian literature, and then one of the first long readable texts that was ever translated was the flood story in the Gilgamesh, and people flipped out when they realized that there was a version of Noah's flood that was older than Noah's flood, but had a lot of the same details. The plot's almost identical. A lot of the wording is similar in two different languages. And so initially people were like, oh, did the Hebrews just steal this from the Babylonians? And then people have fought over what all these similarities mean, and how do you understand the contact between the two cultures? Was it, did they just steal things? Was it, or is it a more superficial, meaningless kind of, oh, well, people just like to tell those kinds of stories. So the connection between those two, what did the creators of the Bible think they were doing? And what is the relationship between the culture that produced the Bible and their neighbors, and in particular Mesopotamia, came together in the book in this way. There are two people who are kind of the role models for scribes and scholars, the role models for the people who wrote a lot of the religious literature that turned into the Bible, or that turned into Mesopotamian religious literature. And in Mesopotamia, there's a very famous one named Adapa, who is, as the great Sumerologist Pyotr Mikulovsky said, he's the most talked about mythological figure from a literary text. I mean, other than the gods, people mention gods all the time, but as a character, he's incredibly popular. And scribes also at some points claimed to be him. They claimed to be this semi-human, superpowered sage who went to heaven, met the gods, and is also said to have uttered a number of the most important works of religious literature. And at the same time, there are a few different people in ancient Judea, in the in the Hebrew and Aramaic writers who created what we have of the Bible and early Jewish literature. There's a few times when these scribes also identify with a heavenly revealer figure. There in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you get a lot of this. People say, "I was enthroned in heaven." People will say, and these are clearly the worshippers or scholars in the it's being used by the Dead Sea Scrolls community. They say, I'll be an enlightened scribe like David. But one of the most popular stories was about this character Enoch. In the Bible, Enoch is just very mysterious. He's the missing patriarch. In Genesis, it says of every one of the patriarchs, and anyone who's tried just opened a Bible and tried to read through Genesis will get these. Methuselah lived this long and he begat this many children, and then he died, and then his child lived this long, begat this many children, and then he died, and this person lived this long and begat this many children, and suddenly with Enoch it says, God took him, and nobody else in the whole Bible is said to have simply been taken up by God. There's a nice heavenly chariot scene with Elijah, but that's about it. So then the question was, both of these, the creators of a lot of Mesopotamian religious literature and the creators of a lot of Hebrew religious literature identified with this kind of super sage. And so I was just curious, did they get the idea from Mesopotamia? Did they steal it, or were they otherwise influenced? How did the influence happen? How did the connection happen? And then B, what did it mean? Like, to say I'm like, to imply that you're like Enoch, or to say I am Adapa, like, what's going on in your head when you say that? So that's the question of the book.
Thank you.